Well, good morning, and thank you all for showing up, and thank you to our panelists who worked, I have no idea how many hours this week, but well over 50, I would guess. So, did a great job. I thank the community for being so supportive and showing up for the interviews, those of you that participated in that process, and thank you all for being here today. We're excited to see the outcome. And I suspect it's going to be a roadmap for more work. We're not afraid of that, but hopefully in the end of the day, it'll help us continue to grow our amazing system. So with that, Carlton Brown was our chair of the group. He kept everyone on task and did a great job and gave us some leadership before the arrival this week on things that we needed hopefully have in place. Panelists were excellent. They asked a lot of good questions. I think we only could answer like 10% of those, but no, that's not true. A lot of good questions. There's some people on this panel that love parks as much as all of us, and that made it a lot of fun. So thank you, Carl.
Okay.
I'll let you get at it.
Okay. I want to thank you for inviting ULI and our team here. To listen to you, to help probably think about things a little differently. In other cases, tell you things that you already knew, but have it confirmed by strangers that came into town. I want to tell you a little bit about, you turned it off? Very good. I want to tell you a little bit of, I'll tell you a little bit about ULI. This thing is taking off. Something crazy is going on. ULI is a volunteer organization. It's been around since 1947, thereabouts. We've done 700 panels across the country. There are 45,000 members. It's a volunteer organization, and we focus on land use, public policy, and the advisory services does this. We've done over 700 panels across the nation and in foreign countries, in places very much like Kansas City, where we work to help people understand solutions for problems and bringing in new ideas and new visions. To wait on this, I could keep the introduction going. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves first, starting with this end.
My name is David Abraham, and I am a research scientist and lecturer at Rice University in Houston. I specialize in sustainability planning, and specifically with regards to strategic planning and community indicators. Thank you.
My name is Karen Abrams. Good morning. I'm with the Heisen-Davidson in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am the Equitable Development Program Officer there, and for a number of years I've looked at the intersection of race and ethnicity with land use and the built environment.
Good morning. My name is Emeka Moname. I'm with the Menkidi Group out of Washington, D.C. We're a real estate development, investment, and brokerage company. However, today what I focus on and very interested in is my background in public finance and public policy in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, my name is Kate Humphrey. I'm here from the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, where I work on the Public-Private Partnerships team, and our goal is to really help drive development in Detroit's neighborhoods and make sure that our resources are aligned with investment in other areas such as parks.
Good morning, I'm Allison Schapker. I'm coming to you from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I work with the Fairmount Park Conservancy. We are the citywide nonprofit partner to our city's Parks and Recreation Department. And there my role is to work with communities to aggregate investment and make decisions about the future of the parks in their neighborhood.
And good morning, my name is Bonnie Roy. I am a partner of SWT Design. I'm a landscape architect, urban designer, and certified planner, of which I like really pulling all of those intersections together. Most of our work is in public spaces, so community parks, public open space, streetscapes, parks and recreation. So I'm bringing that perspective to the panel.
We are all here at the invitation and part of a program for Kansas City Parks, and the 10-minute walk, which is a joint project of the Urban Land Institute and the Trust for Public Land. And the notion is that those organizations wants to be sure that every citizen is within 10 minutes walk of a public park because it has health implications for everyone, and public parks have environmental impacts that are good for all of us. And so it's one of the big programs that we're doing and why we're doing this in several cities. Beyond thanking the sponsors, I want to thank all the people who took time, and there's a lot of you that came to be interviewed, to let us ask you a lot of silly questions in some cases good questions, you know, that hopefully have started you to think. So that's important because anything we do here or tell you is a result of our, first of all, listening, because that's our most important skill, and second of all, transferring what we have learned from other communities, from our other practices. So I don't really need the slides to talk to you about my couple of points. Then we're going to have to take a pause until we get the slides going, maybe. But I wanted to tell you about the panel assignment, why we are here. One big question with a whole lot of subtext on it. It says, what can we do, how can we use the parks system to mitigate a long history of inequity in public policy and land use in Kansas City? And it goes back a long time, and just as it took a long time to create these problems, but we need to recognize these problems won't be solved instantly. But what we would like to think that this is the beginning of a process largely that can be started with people inside the community to solve them. And what we have is some recommendations and some questions, right, that were basically came from Terry, you know, about what are the big issues, you know, that she has. And we, after our interviews and talking among each other, there were some key observations we made, just generally, big picture things. And ultimately, these panelists are going to really dig down much deeper into these things, but key sort of top-line observations about parks, Department of Parks and Recreation, and the things that need to be given some thought, because we saw some things that just didn't make a lot of sense, or left us with questions, or et cetera. And so one was the quality of the internal and external mission clarity, right? Is everyone in Parks and Recreation clear about the mission? Are your customers clear about what your mission are? Do you really start to think of the people you service as your customers and value feedback loops so you can have a system of continuous improvement? And so that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about there, just from a high level, that we had concerns that there was room for improvement or ways to rethink that. Other things we talked about were more structural from the government standpoint. Is there a clear way for interdepartmental communication, regulation of financial controls, and assignment of responsibilities to the departments that has the most depth of experience for doing that? In some cases, we were concerned that people were taking on things that were not their primary, they weren't in their powerhouse, right? And so how do we make those things a little bit better so they can be more effective in how those services are delivered and the cost of those services? Is there a shared public sector vision? Does everyone from the city manager to the mayor to the city council to the commissioners to everyone throughout the organization, do they have a same clear picture of what the mission is of the organization? Does that mission need to change as time goes forward? Has the mission been static is the mission responding to economic conditions, social conditions, the conditions on the ground, or is a mission that is there solely for historical reasons? So how do you make sure that the mission fits with the contemporary indexes and things that we face daily? They're going to tell you about big concerns about, I think the word Mecca used was a physical cliff. One of the challenges that we are concerned about, and I think you're concerned about it, is that there are expanding kind of off-book liabilities. You know, your capital liabilities go into a budget and people kind of know it. But there, where you build capital facilities and there is no reserve set up for maintaining those things, as those facilities age, you're going to have these off-balance sheet expenses that you're going to have to deal with. On balance sheet for older facilities, there are probably, we've heard different numbers, but any place from $25 million to $60 million of stuff, you're in the hole. No reserves, and that's just to keep things operating back up to steady state, because some things aren't at steady state right now. At the same time that you are in the hole, you're building new facilities. You know, you're taking on new assets that are going to have that same curve. While they are new, the maintenance is low, but as they age, mechanical systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems are all going to require a little more tender loving care, which requires resources. Your resource curve is flat. Your revenues is flat. You're driven by the 1/2 cent sales tax. There was a time, you know, during the recession when your reserves were down to 3%, and they're probably a little better now, almost 20%. But what happens with the next recession? The reserves go down, the revenues go down, your liabilities are going up. You know, how do you manage that? What do you do now to plan for the rainy day? Because the rainy day will come. If you were a business, you would really be concerned about that. And you are a business, right? You are a business, a B2C business that has a responsibility to provide services for your customers, and your customers pay for those services through a tax base. So you really got to start to think about how do you do this more effectively. Thank you. Can I advance this past? Because we blew right through it. This thing kind of, okay, blow up.
You're getting closer.
Soon I'm going to start telling jokes, or playing my harmonica, one of the two. I'm not sure which one. And so, PIAC funding. Though that sort of seems to be a staple of what you do, it gets divided equally among 6 districts. The challenge is, if needs are not equal distribution does not equal equity. And so where there are greater needs, why should you get the same amount of money as someone that has fewer needs? We thought, just from a structural standpoint or a policy standpoint, it didn't make a lot of sense, and it's something that sort of, for outsiders that ride in for 4 or 5 days, there were a lot of question marks about why that is that way. Another thing we found is that we don't think the city, and this is beyond parks and recreation, but the city as a whole is leveraging the investments that they've made in parks and recreation to create long-term value, not only for residents that live here, but to attract new residents to the district, to the city. What happens is demographics in some ways work for you. Can this advance yet? Demographics, there we are. So demographics in some ways are working for you, in that the largest generation are people that like cities, they like public parks, they want to live around public parks. But when we look at the zoning and density regulation, one-story buildings, right? You don't have 3-story, 4-story, 5-story, 10-story buildings where you can increase density and offer people an urban experience. You have the potential to offer young people a better urban experience than any other city in the state of Missouri or in the region because of the investments you've made in parks, but you haven't leveraged those investments with changes in zoning regulations and development incentives to encourage development there. One of the things that we were asked about was this whole notion of equity. Well, it's really tied into a lot of things, right? First of all, we said the big challenge, one of the big challenges to get to equity is having a real engagement process with your customers. Who are your customers? What are their needs? How do you fulfill those needs? How well are you doing? That's how you start to understand getting to specific equity solutions here. We seem to, in our quick observation, saw that there seem to be some challenges in doing that. And probably the last thing that we recognized as observations were potentially a problem was that you're missing a huge opportunity in that you haven't formed partnerships with all the external organizations that can help lift you up. We talk to people, we ask them Google stuff. Google knows everything, I guess. But one of the things that Google told us is that this city, in addition to being a World Heritage for its culture site, there's a partnership with Google with 15 cultural institutions, right? But have you really leveraged partnerships with those cultural institutions to provide content, i.e. programming for programs inside the park? They have budgets for doing that. They have expertise for doing that. You have a greater form partnerships for conservancies, not just for a park, but for all the parks. So you can engage with philanthropy, so you can engage with corporate leadership. Have you formed those partnerships with community members so that community members can take pride and have some ownership for their parks and their communities? So those partnerships and that community engagement are the sort of last two pillars that we thought needed to be addressed. Having talked until the machine starts working again, I'm going to pass this on to David, because I was supposed to talk 3 minutes. But
Interesting role to play here to lead off kind of the analysis and our kind of deep dive into your wonderful city and its park system. And after my presentation, I have to go catch an Uber because my flight starts boarding at 10:30. Okay, so please excuse me. It's not because I wanted to just drop a bomb and run. No, but seriously, it was actually really exciting looking into this stretching plan. So what you see here is 2 maps. What I did also was to overlay the floodplains. Because we think from an environmental perspective, you should obviously have a nice sense of the spatial stretch of your city. So what you can grasp from here is obviously that you're dealing with a park system that's at least 3 times, right? At least 3 times as large as Kessler planned for back in the early 20th century. In 1920, you had 324,000 people. Today, it's 479, 480,000 people approximately. Right, we're dealing with the ACS. That system was based on 60 square miles, right? Today you have 318 square miles. So it's a lot less dense, a lot more people. Some people put it as each Kansas City resident is having to pretty much deal with 3 times as much parkland as was planned for with the original Kessler design. People talk about Kessler all over the world. It was part of the City Beautiful movement. It is a wonderful 6 different districts that you're broken into. I think most of you are relatively familiar with your own city. District 1 and 2 to the north are kind of the suburban districts. Then you have districts 3, 6, and 5, and 4 to the south. And what we've done, excuse me, what we've done was to, in the briefing book given to us prepared for us by the planning department, by the Parks Department, excuse me. What they pointed out was that you have 6 zip codes in District 3, which are representative of the zip codes with the greatest disparity in the city, specifically with life expectancy. So what we've done was to highlight the neighborhoods that fall within those neighborhoods, within those zip codes, excuse me, and they fall primarily in District 3, right? District 3 is pretty much the same land area that Kessler, 75–60% of the area that Kessler had actually chosen for his plan. And we compare that to an area in the north, to the Shoal Creek neighborhood, actually. And that's most of District 1. Shoal Creek neighborhood is 33 square miles. The 6 zip codes that fall in District 3 are 11 square miles, right? So let's compare those two, right? 33 square miles of a neighborhood, one neighborhood in the north, and the one around the 6 zip codes is pretty much approximately 10 neighborhoods, but together they're a third of the size of that one neighborhood. They both have approximately the same number of people. In the Shoal case, in the Shoal Creek neighborhood example, there are 30,000 people, 31,000 people approximately. And in the inner city neighborhood, there are 36,000 people, right? So those of you who are already doing the math can start to think about the density that's realized there. In the Shoal Creek case, you have 924 people per square mile, and in the inner city area, you have over 3,000 people per square mile. So the inner city area is much more dense, but we know it's also much less economically advantageous to invest there at this time. Getting into the parks component of things, in the Shoal Creek neighborhood, you have over 1,000 square miles of parkland that our Parks Department is tasked with managing. 1,200 acres to be exact, and in the inner city neighborhood, it's 673 acres of parkland. So without understanding who lives there or what happens there, you know, some objective planner out there might say, oh, well, the inner city neighborhood has more density, has less parkland, so obviously, you know, it might seem like a better market to invest. But certainly we know the context, and the context that we wanted to highlight here is the great burden that the Parks Department has in trying to manage the Shoal Creek neighborhood in comparison to the more inner city neighborhood to the south. Oh, how nice. I guess I should do that. It's not moving. Oh, here we go. So, excuse me?
Just let us flag it, we will, yes.
Okay, so no longer using the pointer. All right, so what we have here is I was able to pull some data are the areas with the higher property values and the lighter areas with the lower property values, and again overlaying the park system. So we can see that to the center of the city is that area, right? The methodology used for this particular assessment was using something called Jegs Breaks. It doesn't matter what the name, but in any event, it looks at the data and the distribution of the data and tries to identify sharp changes in the data. And so I presented it here to show you that, you know, who knows the difference between that straight line appearing, right, to the west. So who knows the name of that street? Right? So the objective data knows Troost. It's Mac Troost. Everybody is Mac Troost. The fascinating thing about Troost is that, the fascinating thing about the east-west divide is that it extends even beyond or below that floodplain extension running through the middle of it. And normally, natural features tend to break the difference between one area and another. You know, we're humans, we all heard about the other side of the railroad track. So if we're faced with some kind of boundary, whether it be an infrastructural boundary or a natural boundary, we tend to think, oh, that's another kind of an area. But the disparity extends way down to the south, almost as if the name Troost and that street itself is now forming a stronger boundary than the natural boundary that's presented in this city. And so you also have the, next slide please. So we could talk about the fragmentation, natural boundary fragmentation versus, we can call it man-made boundary fragmentation. So you have a north-south fragmentation also. The Missouri River, obviously, everybody knows, presents a major, first it was the middle of the center of the city, but today it is kind of separating north and south. So first it kind of forces, it seems, more suburban leapfrog development, right? People kind of go over the river and build outside with new open lands as far as possible, where the land value is obviously cheaper, and they don't want the industrial, or they didn't want the industrial kind of effect that they were experiencing in the last 40, 50 years or so. But there's an opportunity to connect the north and south. We heard from the Downtown Management District and another conservancy that there are some efforts to reactivate the parks along that area and also do more redevelopment, and we think that's excellent. You also have an east-west fragmentation with regards to the Blue River. Who's familiar with the Blue River? The Blue River forms actually down the kind of a perpendicular X right down through your city. That, and you can see by the color differences, just without even understanding what those colors or dots meant, you can see by the color differences that there is a difference, right? So that's a clear difference. Another natural boundary difference that you have that you could overcome, again with parks activation and forming, extending the Kessler idea of these boulevards and linear trails to be able to extend to that. And then, of course, the Truce Avenue, as we mentioned before, it's not a natural boundary. It really is a man-made boundary. And for many investors would really like to extend past that boundary to be able to, next slide please. Many investors would like to be able to extend past that boundary because, quite frankly, it's affordable. But there's a perception, a cultural perception, a sociocultural pretty much perception, or a psychosocial cultural perception existing that I'm sure the Parks Department wanted us to at least address as part of our research. Excuse me. This slide shows in the dark purple areas. You guys brought in the trust for the reinvestment fund, 2 years ago, and they did a market value assessment. And the dark purple areas are the areas with the highest property median sales price, at $318.9 thousand approximately. And the darker orange areas are 6,000, right? And so, just a slight difference, right? But what you can see is that the natural boundary, as we talked about, that runs through the middle of the city, does create a difference, right? It doesn't create a difference on the east side, right? It creates a difference on the west side. So it's acting naturally on the west side. On the east side, it's not, right? So over here, we could talk about market impacts of these kind of anthropogenic versus natural divisions with regards to access to grocery stores. Grocery stores have a really interesting business model because, as you know, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in many cases, you read the business literature on supermarkets. They say, oh, the market is saturated. We don't have space for more groceries. And we all know, it would be nice to walk to a grocery store. And if you're not living close to a grocery store, and you have access to restaurants or fast food, it might lead actually to some health issues. We have a huge problem in this country today with obesity, and it might be coming as a result of not having access to fresh fruits and vegetables, but instead having to depend on something more reliable like a restaurant where the food is great and you eat a lot. We also have health impacts that we could call out here with regards to access to parks, right? On the east side, it's a nice array of parks on the east side, and my colleagues are going to talk further about the economic opportunities that could be realized with investment around parks, and they'll also be talking about the equity issues that have to also be addressed if you want to do that. But just to let you know, we have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we'll cover that as well. And then, of course, we wanted to get more into the libraries. What you can't see here is Well, the green circles are the libraries. And you can see then that there are way more libraries, even though, as we mentioned, the east side has 30,000 people living there on part of it, right? That's half of that area. They only have 3, 4, 5 libraries. And the west side has many, many more. So that's a clear disparity with regards to access to services, but also it shows you spatially and visually what's happening to our public investment dollars, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, so my last slide, again, I'm going to tell you, I'm not running away, I'm not jumping upon. I have to go catch an Uber. On the left is a suite of goals that are metrics that were presented as part of your master plan in 2015, and so in that plan there was a call for performance metrics and thresholds so that you can know when you're meeting the best practices. And so we wanted to present that on the left with some recommendations on the right. And we think, again, as echoed by my colleague Carlton here, having visions and goals should drive metrics. Metrics should not drive your visions and goals. And so you're going to hear that running through our entire presentation, is we believe that you have an amazing system and you have an excellent opportunity that you should play on, but perhaps it's time to maybe craft a new vision and craft a new language that can get the message out with regards to activating your obviously engaged citizens here on the future of parks and sustainability of parks in the city. Thank you very much.
Good morning again. My name is Karen Abrams, and as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, I work at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and land use policy in the built environment. I'm going to give pretty much a historical context to some of the conditions that are existing in the city today, and I'm going to just go through a timeline about that. You can go to the next slide. So during our visit, talking to residents, one resident in particular said that you can't talk about parks without the city around the parks. And so I'm going to go through the timeline pretty quickly. I guess we can't. I guess we can't do the animation that Emeka spent a lot of time helping me with. It was a really good animation. And I didn't want you to see all of this at one time because there's a lot of information, but I'll try to go through it pretty quickly. So the first 4 pieces of this are around the parks. And so there's really the creation of the Parks Department, and just the ability for the Parks Department to really acquire land. That's a very important part of the history of the land use and land use policies. So in 1906 was when racial covenants were introduced. They were introduced in Kansas City. And actually the racial covenants were pretty much born here, and they were actually borrowed by lots of other places around the country, particularly to keep African Americans and people of color out of predominantly white neighborhoods. This is a very important part of this conversation because these covenants lasted, officially for about 30 years. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of African Americans at this time, this is the beginning of Jim Crow in the South, this is people escaping racial terror, this is people looking for job opportunities who are coming into the city. And we talk about having racial covenants, people were steered to existing predominantly African American enclaves, but they were steered that there was no choice for them to actually be able to move around. This is also the time when Bruce Watkins' family moved here. Bruce Watkins is in this building right now. His family moved from a part of Missouri to come here for economic opportunity. So his family was met with, you cannot live in this space because your family is African American. So then we go into where parks plays a really unique role in this, this racialization of space and housing for African Americans. A lot of elite whites literally used the parks as buffers to buffer themselves away from African Americans and poor communities. And the parks policies allow that to happen. And so for about 10 years, the homeowners associations really made an effort to use the parks in that way. That was eventually stopped when they tried to formalize it. The Parks Department stopped that practice, but by then the damage had been done. People were living separately with this, spatially separated with the parks in mind. And so we go into in 1923 with the Federal Home Loan Act. And this is the very beginning of redlining. This is when the banks are telling people how to invest, where their mortgages can go. This is actually critical because this is where wealth building really began in communities. And where when you were able to actually buy a home, you created wealth. And most African Americans lived in areas that they could not get a mortgage, so they could not build wealth to pass on to future generations. And so that is a critical part of this conversation, especially when we're talking about where people are able to live and invest. So people were renting their homes, they couldn't invest in places that they had lived for decades possibly. They had to just continue to rent. And because of the racial hysteria, the conditions in these neighborhoods was really, really swollen. This is not unique to Kansas City, it's happened nationally. But it created this urban core where people are really trapped in place. They cannot move physically. And so by FHA supports this continued racialization of space. The FHA between 1934 and 1962 approved 77,000 homes for mortgages. Only 1% of those homes were for Black residents. And so at this time, during is the GI Bill, which is another very important part of this conversation. So Bruce R. Watkins was a Tuskegee Airman. He came back from the war, but he could not use his GI Bill to buy a house in the city because he was forced to go into a different community. I'm not sure his family history, but people like him came back from the war and had fought for freedom and came back to racist practices and could not live where they wanted to live. This is a very important point to make. By 1960, which is another important, this is all very important, I keep saying that. But by 1960, these practices were rendered illegal. In the 60s, they were rendered illegal. The 1960s is also the time when Mr. Watkins started the Freedom Corporation, which really talked about racial equity and freedom of civil rights, because at that time, there's segregation in schools and theaters and all kinds of places, so there was no opportunity for people to actually live their lives freely. It was also the time when Kansas City started annexing parts of the city. This is significant because this is essentially white flight within the urban core, within the urban footprint. So we are hollowing out resources that should be kept at the urban core, but continuing to annex spaces so that people of means and predominantly white populations can continue to move out was significantly harmful for the very people who needed those resources. And so this is something that we really need to look at in Kansas City, how these spaces got this way and what needs to be done to really correct some really insidious things that happened in the past. And they continue to kind of filter into some of the practices that continue to happen. So we can go to the next slide. And this is just the visualization of what I just talked about. This is the redlining map, and as you can see, these are those 6 zip codes that David referenced. These red areas, there was no ability for people to invest in their futures. We can go to the next slide, but this is basically current data. This is the poverty data that comes from Policy Link's analysis of Kansas City. And as you can see, it's the same areas. If you go to the next slide, this is unemployment, same areas. Go to the next slide. Maybe we can go on and on. This is about carlessness, and so obviously cars provide opportunities for people to get to the parks and to get to spaces. But a lot of the folks who live in this area don't have access to cars. They have public transportation, they rely on friends and family to get them places, and they rely on walking and biking. But that's not always practical when we're trying to get groceries, right? And we're trying to actually have leisurely time away from, your in parks. Next slide is the food deserts. We can go to the next slide, which is the commute times for these people in these 6 zip codes and beyond. Then you go to the next slide. So I won't talk about all these points for time, but we'll kind of examine some of the points here. So the first is the very top-down decision-making that was made back in the, from the late 1800s, all the way through like the mid to late 1900s. These folks did not have agency. They would have the right to vote. They were forced to live in places they couldn't live. No one consulted them about anything. Their lives were in the hands of people who really did not care about what conditions they were living in. So just recognizing that for your current engagement processes in these neighborhoods is very, very essential. The next point I want to talk about, and I wrote this down, I'm going to read it verbatim because I think it's extremely important to this conversation. And it's the first bullet up top on the right. The expanded municipal footprint beyond the source of municipal revenues reduces resources to the urban core. I'll read it again. I'm reading it, it's not set up there, but literally when people are in the conditions that they're in, when they're living in squalid conditions, when they're living in places that are harmful to them, when they have no opportunity to move and better their lives and lives of their children, when the annexation happens, those resources start going other places. Resources are spread pretty thin. And when the tax base, the revenue is coming from the core, is put into different places, it takes away from the very people who need those resources. That's a very important part of this conversation, and that's like the core of racial injustice in this country and in this city specifically. So let's go to the next slide. There is some good news, some promising news. Because we are here talking about this, and KC Parks has asked us to come here, that is good news. KC Parks recognizes that this is a problem. It is a problem about resource allocation of their funds to these neighborhoods, and obviously having to cover the neighbors that were annexed as well. They are champions around these issues at the leadership. Terry and her team, her deputy directors, are champions of this. They've started to look at social equity. They have social equity team working on this very issue. But it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. And hopefully more champions will pop up in KC Parks to really address these issues and work with other municipal services as well to provide assistance. But I wanted to talk specifically about the second bullet. I'm sorry. The second bullet. I know that part of the question was trying to figure out how to do more equitable planning and development. That conversation has to happen with the residents in your communities. It cannot happen in your office. In Pittsburgh, PolicyLink took us through a process where we had a nonprofit working on the ground with neighborhoods. It took about a year to come up with a shared definition of what equitable development meant. As Carlton mentioned, it took a long time for this to happen to these communities. It takes a lot of work. It won't happen overnight. This is not an easy fix. It takes time and effort. So having those conversations in community will actually make the process more equitable and more just for the residents in those communities. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was doing a racial equity assessment in your organization. Literally doing an audit with the staff and the commissioners. You cannot fix someone else's house if you don't fix your own house. And so you might discover that there's some really great things happening at KC Park that you can capitalize on, and other things that are not so awesome. So looking at procurement practices, your MWBE practices, are you giving enough people of color that you're procuring services to, or actually paying people to do services for you? Do you have a culture that is open to different cultural expression? Do you have practices and policies that are harmful to your employees? Doing an audit of what your policies are for parks and communities is also very important. And finally, I want to talk about residents as park assets. Those are your most valuable park assets, the residents who live near the parks. These are residents who use the parks for leisure activities, for cultural expression, for healing, for recreation. One of our interviewees mentioned that, people don't have cars. They can't necessarily go on vacation. Their vacation time is in their parks. And so these are the folks who are very passionate about their park spaces, and we've heard that people love their parks. And when we drove by, these parks are in great condition. And so people want to continue to have engagement with the Parks Department about what could be done. And also, these communities are some of the most resilient and innovative communities in this city. This community's brought you blues, they brought you jazz, they have the Negro Baseball League, and they brought you great barbecue. These folks are creative and resilient, and they know the power of working on little resources and getting big impact. They've had to deal with it because of all of the racism and the spatial racism that's happened in the city. So they have the ideas. Use them. Don't go out of the city to try to find somebody to save you. People who are going to save you are sitting in these neighborhoods. And now I'm going to pass this on to Emeka, who's going to kind of talk about why these, the equity and injustices. Thank you.
Talk a little bit about the money. I think that David and Karen have done a really good job of setting some context. And one of the things that I think our group collectively saw was that the resource constraints that Terry and the team at KC Parks has brought up, what it's really done is it's put in sharp relief all of these equity issues we talked about. It's basically making really clear where these fault lines are as it relates to the physical assets and the program concerns that we have. And so one of the things that a phrase that we're using, which is maybe meant to shock you a little bit, we've talked about the fiscal cliff that KC Parks is dealing with. So let's talk about why we think that there's a fiscal cliff. You've heard a little bit about it. The first piece of it is annexation. Annexation clearly had an impact on the resources of the organization because it expanded the scope and the inventory that KC Parks was responsible for. Second piece was population density decrease, because as you expanded scope, you didn't have population increase that tracked with that increase in space. You're then spreading out people and resources over a larger area and spreading thinner. The data point that really captured my attention was so you have a population that was not going to be able to use as intensively the resources available. The third piece was deferred maintenance. We've heard the number $60 million of deferred maintenance identified for the city. This again ties back into, we have a system that's getting bigger, the nut that we need to take care of is only increasing, and as we expand facilities to serve this annexation and growth, we're adding to the deferred maintenance number. And the last piece is competition for funding sources. I think it's terrific that the 1.5-cent sales tax was put in place, but we understand, at least we preliminarily understand, that there's other needs in the city that are pulling from that resource. It is not a stable, dedicated, and reliable funding source for the growing asset base of the system. So one of the things I'll just point to your attention on the slide is that the image that we've identified there just shows where the sales tax is coming from. And I think it would actually overlap quite nicely with the image that David showed you at the beginning about the original park system and its footprint. I think if it were more focused in that way, you see a really more equitable overlap of resources on the land area. Can we go to the next slide? So we're going to start to move away from context and talk to you about some of the solutions that we think that make sense. And the first thing, and there's going to be, I'll say, two perspectives. There's a kind of an internal looking process discussion that we need to have. What things can we do to use the resources currently available more efficiently? And then they'll be looking for ways to grow the resource base to do what we want to do going forward. So one of the things that we also picked up in our 4-day deep dive is that while we were brought here to look at parks, there is a citywide resource conversation that we're having at the same time. So a lot of our conversations, our recommendations about resources do talk about what the city needs to do because parks will benefit the city. So it starts to change the way it thinks about resource allocation. Very encouraging. We know that the city's moving towards priority-based budgeting, which I think is a good step to kind of get everybody around the table to think about what are our priorities and let's spend our resources in alignment with those priorities. That's a good start. Where we think the city can lean in a little bit further. Today, we understand as the capital budget's put together, everyone knows that once you build a building for the next 20 years, as Carlton mentioned, you have to maintain that building. We don't talk about that cost when we make a decision to build a new facility. while the finance department does document it, they have a calculation that they know. People in this room probably never find out what that is. Certainly, it's probably possible that council members don't understand the true costs, the long-term, fully loaded cost of that investment. I think an initial step is that we can begin to publish that impact. So when we make a decision to build something new, we know the full cost, not just the marginal cost of building that asset. And then the next and kind of the final that the image talks about, we think you need to begin to reimagine how you do resource allocation. So the proposal that we like to put on the table is this notion of a capital review team, where you're taking the city manager, key leadership in planning and in finance as kind of co-chairs, and then bringing all the agencies that build infrastructure and everybody sitting around the table making decisions together about what do we identify that we want to build, how do we scope it in a way that's most efficient across every agency. It could be that we're building a building, but there's an opportunity to do green and stormwater infrastructure at the same time. Can we co-locate a library at this facility? Can we do other things so we can leverage the limited dollars that we know that we have? This is a best practice that lots of cities around the U.S. is going, and it sounds like with the leadership in the finance department and the planning department, this is something that we can use as a way to begin to use what we have a little bit better. A second, and this is just an example, and it relates to KC Parks, is that as I was looking through the budget, I saw that there's street maintenance for parkways, roads, streets, this goes on, 135 miles that KC Parks is responsible for, but you also have a public works department that does a very similar thing for a much larger footprint, and with a much larger budget, frankly. It feels like if I were to guess, street maintenance is probably not a core competency of parks, while maintaining parks is probably a core competency, whereas DPW, that's what they wake up thinking about every day. There may be the ability to look at things that Parks is doing today that are not in their core competency and moving it somewhere else, and the dollars will be in that location. So those are some of the process-oriented recommendations around resources. Can we go to the next slide, please? One other example that I do want to highlight, and this is kind of related to the street maintenance, it's kind of a rescoping. And we decided to focus on and give you a case study around golf operations. So the city has 5 golf courses spread across the city, and it essentially breaks even as we understand today, which I think is fine. Also has had a consistent user base, a fairly small user base if you look at it within the larger metropolitan area, 150 rounds a year in a $2 million person regional population. We think that there's some redundancy and there's some efficiencies that can be found in rethinking the use of some of the land that's currently set aside for golf operations to do other things. And we found a case study in Detroit where they did something very similar. Detroit, like Kansas City, a very large footprint, and lots of facilities that could be redundant, and they had, at least one golf course that you operate, it sat in a floodplain. And they were able to take that park and reimagine that park that was sitting in the floodplain as a stormwater mitigation tool, and be able to find other ways to generate net revenue from it. So there's 2 specific recommendations. We have Heart of America and Swope Park that currently, while it does break even, it has a $200,000 a year cost to deal with flooding because it sits in a floodplain. We think that you could build green infrastructure in that space, relocate the first tee and all the good services for the community that are located there next door to Swope Memorial, and then look to see if you could find some lease revenue by taking some portion of the space and bring in some sort of an entertainment facility that's golf-oriented. I'll let you fill in the blank what that could be. And there may be a way to actually generate net revenue from that rethinking. You could take dollars that are already in the stormwater budget for overflow control program and use that to build the GCI, or the GSI, I'm sorry. The second recommendation, just to provide some balance geographically, is to look at the golf facilities in the north, Shoal Creek and Hodge Park. They are literally adjacent, connected by an underground tunnel. There seems to be, they're both basically dealing with a similar amount of users. Given that there's not a lot of competition, I think, for municipal golf in the region, we think that there could be significant savings by reducing the footprint of golf operations and taking the revenues there and rethinking the use of that land. I do want to just kind of offer some caveats, because I know that there's I've highlighted golf not because I dislike golf. I'm actually involved in a golf project back in DC. No offense there, but it is one of those services that Casey Parks provides. It is only for individuals that have the resources to pay for it. It doesn't serve the broader community, and so we think that that's worth exploring. The second piece is that, recognizing that Heart of America is historic, and it has a history. There's a reason why it's there. We're sensitive to that, but we also recognize at the same time its location is actually a symptom of historic inequities in the past. The decision to put in a floodplain for African Americans to use, we think, is important to not ignore. And so this would be a way to reposition and take advantage of that situation, still provide the services for the neighborhood, but also in a way start to heal some of the historic inequities. I think the last thing that I'm going to offer before I ask my colleague Kate to join you is that I want to talk, again, coming from a public policy background, we were taught that your budget is your policy. It is the clearest way that you as a community say and express what is important. Where your dollars go are lined up to what you think is important. So as my parents would say, words matter. And so as I was reading through the budget, there was a couple of things that jumped out at me about how we talk about investment, how we talk about what we value, how we talk about what's important. And it really kind of really focused in on the tension between growth, development, expansion, leading into annexation versus caring for what we've already built and kind of putting our values in budget. And so I will read what I put on the screen because I do think it's important. I want to highlight it. It says that we believe that funding decisions are based upon demographic growth patterns with additional effort made to complete projects begun in previous years. Furthermore, improvements outside of the central city have been targeted at key infrastructure links which experience substantial growth, and attention will continue to be given to meeting the developing needs of those areas. This is the clearest way to say that we're going to spend more versus leaning into what we've already built and caring for it. We need to change the language to match up with our policy intent. And so my colleagues are going to begin to speak a little bit about how we're going to do that. But I do think it's important, and this is where I think leadership at the city level needs to come. We need to make sure that what we believe and what we want to happen is reflected in the words that we choose to use. And so with that, I'll ask Katie to talk to you about some of our opportunities to optimize these investments in infrastructure.
I'm going to build on Emeka's comments a little bit to bring that more into a geographic focus. Beyond kind of the efficiency and best practices for fiscal management, how can this have a better impact as far as doing coordinated planning citywide? We heard several times this week the city is really currently lacking a unified strategy for where we want to direct growth. We know that the comprehensive plan is out of date and there's an update coming, but in the meantime, that's been replaced with separate area plans. It's unclear to us if those are really talking to each other or if they're representing their role as being part of a bigger whole. No real strategy for tying growth areas to infrastructure, whether what's available today or if there's a plan in place to make sure that that can be sustainably provided in the future. And what that's doing is really lacking the city's ability to leverage those investments across different categories. Decisions are being made on an ad hoc basis based on political factors, convenience, what's shovel-ready rather than what's needed. And because the city doesn't have this overall vision to kind of look to in making those decisions, that ability is being lost. So we see a great opportunity for greater coordination, not only within the capital planning process itself, making sure that the capital plan is tying back to area plans, to plans that are put forward by individual departments for areas that they're going to focus on, then also the regulatory framework for where new development is being encouraged to happen. And when those limited resources are stretched so thin geographically, it's really hard to kind of build that impact that you want your public investment to have. And so one example is in Detroit. We obviously have very different development and equity challenges than Kansas City, but we've been applying a very targeted investment strategy that's resulted in the Strategic Neighborhood Fund. And one way that that looks on the ground, in the bottom image, the red line there is where there's being concentrated streetscape improvements and investment in small businesses. All of the blue circles are infill development. Some of that is led with public-private partnerships on publicly owned land. Some of it is totally privately driven. And the green there is a large park investment. So that's the city saying very clearly to the development community, to the philanthropic community, this is where we're going to put all of our eggs in this basket. We want you to come along with us. And that is really showing how a park can be one pillar in a bigger neighborhood transformation. And zooming in to really look at layering parks, specifically with other investments, we all know about the great value that parks have and strong and healthy neighborhoods, especially when that's paired with transit, with access to services, employment opportunities, and clean, safe, and decent housing. And so we think there's really great potential for parks to be catalytic and serve as the foundation for attracting other growth. And so if you are able to get in place a broader citywide strategy that can really help you target investment areas as a starting point for driving park-adjacent development, so that would mean working with the planning department, with the housing services department to look at where are they targeting their home repair dollars, where are the CDCs active, where can you make sure that you're going to put your park dollars where there's other activity going on, where there's a higher concentration of residents within the 10-minute walk to make sure that you're really driving your dollars with the greatest impact. And we see housing in particular as a really complementary use. We heard a lot of concerns about safety in the parks, and so really building up that density along the edges can have a great impact, putting eyes on the park, making it feel safer. You can see in the images on the bottom, I mean, I would much rather spend time in the park on the far right than the park on the far left, and that's something that's pretty stark from looking at this, two-dimensional slide. So imagine how that feels to be in a park surrounded by housing. It doesn't obviously have to be single family. Carlton mentioned the need to really build up density along those edges, but trying to look at where does the land bank own parcels that are fronting a park? Where is those resources being driven and available otherwise to really partner with city agencies outside the parks. Parks can't build good parks by themselves. They need other partners in the city and the community to help shore up the area around it. So Kansas City, huge geographical area. According to Trust for Public Land, Casey Parks, 9% of that huge area is in the park system. So we were asked to look at evaluating the highest and best use for some of these assets. Is it feasible or is it desirable to sell some of those assets off for other uses? So a number of considerations there. Revenue generation, that could be one potential way to provide a one-time kind of injection of resources in the system, but shouldn't be seen as any kind of long-term sustainable strategy. We know there are practical challenges related to deed restrictions and the kind of legal use of what you can do with what had been parkland, and obviously the need for voters to approve it. That's a pretty high burden to show that there's a better use for parkland. And then market conditions. If something is not serving a high value as a park because of where it's located, it likely doesn't also have high market value out in the development world as well. So we would encourage Casey Parks to do a really thorough scrubbing of its land inventory to look at which of its assets that are consuming resources and maintenance dollars are really serving their function and worthy of that time and public investment, and which ones aren't. And that could be for any number of reasons. There's definitely been some scope creep, willing or unwilling for the park system to assume responsibility for things that aren't really in its wheelhouse, in its best interest or the public interest for those to live in the park system. It's really thinking about creative ways to add value. We did hear specific questions about the tennis courts by Country Club Plaza. Is there a way that those could maybe be incorporated into a new mixed-use development to have that public serving use on the first floor, maybe some other uses above it, and a real public-private partnership, maybe exploring transfer of development rights or land swaps or other ways to kind of extract the most value from those resources while still serving at least some of their recreational needs. And then finally, I want to touch on some of the past and current practices in parkland dedication to kind of get out of the urban core and back up north to the Northland. We heard a lot about tensions between the desire to support the growth that's happening up north, but the need also to maintain and sustain the system in the center city to the south. So the northern development pattern is largely driven by private developers and subdivision regulations that allow developers, when they come in to build these projects, to either dedicate land for public parks with certain standards, provide private facilities for their own residents, make a payment in lieu of those things, or any combination of all three. And those practices on the ground have resulted in the park system assuming responsibility for what is really functioning as private, open space, right up to people's backyards with limited, if any, public access. And so there's one example of that, the northeast portion of Shoal Creek. Just want to zoom in on this area. So you can see the kind of the sage green colored there. Those three areas are what's designated as public parkland that's owned and operated and maintained by Casey Parks. It's really indistinguishable from the lighter green kind of stream buffer areas that surround it. So zooming in more specifically to Quail Ridge Park, you can see it's certainly lacking in public access. The one place you could conceivably get into that from outside of the subdivision is that kind of cul-de-sac that stubs right up to the end. And so I think we heard from a lot of residents in the Northland, they feel like they're not getting the same resources as those in the center city. They only have 2 community centers versus 8 south of the river, and I think that can be explained, at least in some part, by the fact that resources that could have been spent on those facilities are instead being used as somebody's backyard. So we recommend changes to how you approach the subdivision regulations and working with private developers to really strengthen the city's position in those negotiations. And Allison's going to talk a little bit more about the structure that can get you there.
Good morning, everybody, or is it good afternoon at this point? I really appreciate you all sticking with this presentation. Emeka did a really great job in talking about how resources are allocated within the city government and how the city government might be able to allocate those resources more efficiently. At the heart of all of our conversations today around equity has been a conversation about resource allocation. I'm going to share with you how Kansas City Parks can actually expand that pie of resources, both financial capital, social capital, and knowledge capital, and create new park-focused governance structures that re-engage community members into the system's respect and appreciation for the Parks Department and the work that they do. I've seen a community of people that recognize that their park system is one of the things that sets their city apart and makes them really special. And as someone coming from a large park system, I recognize how hard it is to serve everyone really well in an urban park system and give everyone what they want. But one of the things that we heard around these parks were that there were sometimes dead zones, or sometimes the park seemed particularly quiet. And we also heard from community members that they sometimes felt cut off from what these parks were to them today and to their families. And so there's a tension between a beautiful historic park and the way that people recreate today and what communities today need. And so these governance principles are set up as a lens, and you may decide that there are completely different principles, but here are 4 suggested principles to think about as the city and the community makes overall decisions about governing their parks. First of all, your parks are pieces of civic infrastructure. They are part of your health system. They should be part of your system of arts and culture. They should be part of your educational system. So they are platforms that can be programmed and used by a variety of different users, leading to more equitable, engaged communities. Second of all, we heard a lot about what happens with top-down, disengaged decision-making about resources. There is leadership and diverse participation already happening in these neighborhoods. Let's engage that leadership in making decisions about parks. We need to think about the whole neighborhood, and we need to convene partners, and we need to coordinate investment to make sure we have maximum impact. And that's a little bit of what Kate was talking about relative to housing in Detroit. So today, the system is pretty centralized. Kansas City Parks has a set of capital coming through the city that they have to do a whole lot of different things with across a whole lot of different stuff. It's a lot of responsibility, and it's a small pie of resources. We want to figure out, are there ways to expand that pie? Let's make the pie get bigger. And so we begin to look at 2 new governance structures. Diagram's a little complicated. I'm not going to go through all of it in detail, but what's really important for you to know is that the park system is the programs, the places, and the people. That's what we're interested in organizing and governing towards a more equitable outcome. So the first entity that we propose is a conservancy. A conservancy is able to access philanthropic funds for reinvestment in place-making projects and physical stuff in the historic Kessler Core. This is the oldest part of the system. It probably needs the most maintenance, and we've also seen in presentation after presentation today, this is the part of the city that has been systematically disinvested from. However, we recognize that there is still one Kansas City, and the community building is important through the entire city. We propose that a second function of this conservancy be tasked with organizing and supporting those park friends, those neighbors that are already out weeding, doing youth sports, being the eyes and ears on this park. Let's give these neighbors, let's give these residents support, education, training, money, and let's integrate this network of park friends into the formal decision-making process about the park system and about capital improvements. So what might that look like in terms of responsibility now? Well, you can see that we've expanded the types of capital we're able to access. The city is able to maintain its municipal sources. It continues to do the regular operations, the maintenance, the regular capital improvements at the parks and parkways. But what we've done is move out some of the other core competencies into organizations or entities that are already aligned with delivering on that mission. So as Mecca talked about, maybe the roads move to public works. Maybe the museums and monuments should operate within a museum council where the core competencies of curation and museum operation can live. Let's let our programming partners, all of these service providers whose core mission is programming, arts and culture, health, let them deliver the programming in the park system. And we're seeing some fantastic trail work and trail conservation being done in the region. Let's see if we can't develop organizations that are able to maintain and build the Metro Green Trail Plan, while Parks and Recs can stay focused on the parks and parkways. Philanthropies are, the Conservancy is able to access and nurture and cultivate relationships across a larger sources of financial capital. And we're also going to cultivate our Park Friends Network and develop that neighborhood knowledge, local relationship, and cultural competencies. And let them be responsible for organizing, planning, and prioritizing neighborhood capital collaboratively with the city and the Conservancy. So these are the three recommendations on the left-hand side that I've already talked to you about. On the right-hand side, I just want to mention that the Conservancy should, as a first priority, establish an endowment policy to ensure that the maintenance obligations of work that it is a part of are sustained by the Conservancy up front. Second, again, activating the park through programming partnerships. And finally, establish a park equity fund administered by the Conservancy to facilitate the priorities of neighbors through the Park Friends Network, measure progress towards equitable park development, and fund ground-up programming. Thank you.
I promise I will be quick. End of the line, it's the shortest stick, right? My fellow panelists have posed a lot of different ideas, and I'm sure trying to present the 4 days of intense conversation and 24/7 focus we have had on KC Parks is hard to convey in an hour and a half. So, these next few slides are our attempt in trying to illustrate to you how to apply a lot of these contexts, a lot of these recommendations. So, common themes of social, fiscal guidelines, recommending that parks really look at evaluating the role of the assets that they have today and how they're playing in each of those immediate contexts. What is the role of a park in an urban core neighborhood? What is the role of a park in a Northland neighborhood? How do those differ, and how do they work as a system? How do we really look at the relevance of those existing facilities? Parks is doing a fantastic job with the limited resources they have, creating a level of service, looking at inclusivity, safety, accessibility, and activating those parks. But how can we look at tighter evaluation criteria and doing that in different areas of the city? And lastly, looking at a hierarchy of maintenance intensity. And the graphic on this slide is really to illustrate, similar to those of you that are familiar with more urban planning and the density of buildings, creating a hierarchy of park systems that can radiate in the same way. So looking at those core commercial activity centers as being the most actively used parks, most densely populated parks, and then requiring the highest level of cost per square foot from a maintenance perspective, and letting that really permeate into the way that those parks are designed as you radiate further out into less dense and less dense areas of the city, all the way to preserving greenfield areas that have not yet been developed, ideally becoming the least costly to maintain within the 318 acres, square miles of the city. Next slide, please. So a few case studies kind of taking you through some of those varying contexts throughout the city. So Swope Park, you heard Emeka talk about Heart of America Golf Course in a floodplain. This graphic here, the yellow being the floodway. We know this area of Blue River floods often and will probably continue to flood even more often with the way we are seeing the environment take hold. So how can we look at consolidating the existing golf program within Swope Park, providing an opportunity to take plus or minus 200 acres and reprogram that? We're suggesting that KC Parks overlay their entire system with the area watersheds, identifying which of those assets are most ideal. So not just Swope Park, as an example, citywide. Look at the opportunities in which parks can contribute to the city's green stormwater infrastructure efforts, as well as building resiliency in the layering of these systems. Next slide, please. So a quick sketch of what that could look like. The yellow dash boundary is the Heart of America Golf Course. Again, this is an opportunity to mitigate stormwater, build upon educational opportunities, habitat restoration, the Lakeside Nature Center, which is just next door to this. Yes, there's a railroad in between, but that's navigable. Looking at opportunities to really be able to better activate a more natural area of the park. Partnerships potentially with state organizations like the Department of Conservation or Natural Resources, and then also looking at the fiscal benefit. We did talk about potentially activating this with another golf entertainment or golf-centric facility. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but how could parks leverage leasing this land for another way to activate Swope Park? Moving on to the north. We're really challenging you to think about the development patterns. And this is a little outside the scope of just parks, but how can we really think about how to better steer the development pattern in a way that would make George Kessler proud? Coordinating with city planning and development, area planning efforts, and concentrating development around existing activity centers. Restricting sprawl, encouraging density, and incentivizing that development around the existing urban core or existing commercial centers, specifically here in the Northland. Looking at realistic growth projections and necessary housing stocks. Don't overbuild. How can we really think about what your growth rate is realistically and designate, instead of area plans that are yellow from seam to seam of single-family housing, where can we concentrate that and not continue to drain the population in the city's core? Refining and enforcing the development requirements for parkland and associated impact fees. Kate gave a great example of what parkland looks like in some of the Northland subdivision development. We're recommending that we really create socially responsible, genuinely accessible to all parkland with these developments that are welcoming to those outside of those neighborhoods, and they're ideally accessible via transit or bike. So the diagram to the right is just a diagram. It's not geographically representative of a building pattern, but suggesting that we focus on centering development around those commercial zones, around those major arterials, and then enabling the boulevards and parkways, which are illustrated in green and very difficult to see, I understand, as part of the major street plan, enabling those to really be the interstitial landscape connecting parks, greenfields, greenways, the trail system, and a network that reflects the original vision of Kessler while strengthening the regional connectivity. And the last case study, in the urban core. So Independence Park Plaza is an intersection we selected specifically because we're already seeing really great things happen here. A multifamily development on the corner, increasing density, and an opportunity to really build greater attention around the park, as we talked about, more people, more eyes on the park, more activation of the park itself. So there's a number of different ways in which we're trying to illustrate all these layers of social, governance, environmental, and fiscal responsibility around the parks, including the neighborhood in deciding what amenities they'd like to have in this park. Maybe it's a shelter, maybe it's a sign, maybe it's trees. These are just suggestions. How can the natural areas think about long-term maintenance? How can they work with the green stormwater infrastructure? How can we think about the boulevard system adjacent to this and the mobility needs that the city has from bike-friendly, active lifestyle opportunities as well as green infrastructure within the cross-section of the street? a number of other potential revenue generating opportunities, or at least return on investment opportunities for the park system. And perhaps Mrs. Thomas, the neighborhood leader, lives in this new development and is recruiting all of her neighbors to be part of this process. And with that, I will hand it over to Carlton to bring us home.
Again, thank you, and we're going to leave you with a couple of core recommendations. Not a lot, because you've already heard a lot, but just some basic things that we want to do that sort of overlay everything everyone already knows. But you've heard people talking about things that were in conflict, some ideas that might change things, but to make those things where we recommend change happen, there has to be a consistent and agreed mission, because otherwise they won't happen. The partnerships. No matter what you say, Kansas City is not going to suddenly start growing like Nashville tomorrow night. So your tax basis for sales tax is not going to suddenly go up by 20% or 30% or anything. Your growth rate is 3%, 5%, something like that. Assume that's what's going to happen. And to increase that, you've got to build better partnerships. Whether it's with philanthropy, whether it's community organizations, whether it was friends, building those sort of partnerships with people in the community to give you better ideas about how you can be utilized, the parks, right? And then the second thing is, a third thing rather, which I'm really strong on. I'm a developer in my real life, right? And what I do is I develop and disinvest in urban communities. And one of the things that I think happens and has happened here is you haven't realized the full potential of your parks to pull people in from other regions, right? People will go, like the last slide we looked at. There's huge opportunity to do that at that sort of moderate density, higher densities. And think about it in a way that you're going to create communities that have more than just housing, but the other resources, the cultural resources, the retail resources and things. So you build out full communities around this park. And if you do that, this is the case, if you build it, they will come. So, questions? We're open for questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Yeah, I didn't know I needed a mic. Jacob Wagner, thank you all for all your time. Amazing work here. I think we'll be thinking about this for quite a while. And as we roll into the comprehensive plan update, I think this gives us a lot of food for thought. What I guess I'm missing, though, is the environmental climate resilience layer. We all know this region is going to be hugely impacted. And I guess I want a whole nother chapter from a similar panel just on climate resilience, because our parks have, especially for the communities of color and communities that have experienced decades of disinvestment, parks were a place to survive a hot summer. And that really hasn't changed. So, you know, that needs to be enhanced, and we need those tools. And as we think about economics, we can't somehow not also include climate resilience. So just kind of a comment.
You're 100% right on that. Allison, you want to?
Exactly, you're 100% right. Parks and the boulevards and the corridors that we get to get to them need to be considered cooling corridors and corridors of refuge during the additional days a year that you're going to have that are 105 degrees above, which I think you're looking at around 60 in this region in the next 20 years. So imagine that. Cities all over the country are beginning to do heat mapping of their neighborhoods and targeting park and stormwater investment around those neighborhoods that are most heat challenged. And that would be a great way of looking at this through the equity lens.
I think that's a really good point. One of the things we were really mindful of, however, wasn't really telling you stuff about your community that, you know, in 4 days we're not going to know. What we did want to focus on, and I hope that we made this clear is that there's some processes that can help you have these conversations. So the notion of having a capital review team that's not just parks thinking about having a conversation about its assets and how it can use it, it's about the city planning and the finance director helping to have a conversation globally about all the assets to address all the issues that we have and leveraging resources that may be in this agency or this agency to solve that question. So I think there is a process that you can put that question into and then have that conversation.
One more addition. I think one thing that we have talked about over the past few days that to leave you with something really positive, because I know we've also given you several challenges today, is you have a robust system. You have neighborhood parks woven into some of the densest and some of the most challenged subdivisions and neighborhoods within the city. You don't have to go put them there. Now, there are some areas where you do, but you have this infrastructure already. So how can you maximize the potential, maximize the service that those parks are providing?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you all first. So now I'm interested on how, my name is Carl Stafford. I have a nonprofit organization called My Region Wins. We want to obtain blighted areas, especially those that are in commercial business zones owned by land bank. How am I able to contact parks and say, hey, listen to my idea and champion that? Because there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that want to do something, but when we send that email, make that contact, nobody's contacting us back.
Well, okay, I can tell you this. When we say we want to build partnerships, we recommend building partnerships at the community level, building a shared vision from the top of the organization to the bottom. The intent is to be in a position so the city can address those sort of issues. So land bank people are talking to development people, are talking to parks people, etc. And so that's one of our recommendations. How strong that is right now, I don't know. We were here 4 days, right? But I think it's an engagement process. As I think I said earlier, the problems didn't happen last night. They won't be fixed tomorrow night, right? But I think what we do know is because we are here, Terry's invited us, the commissioners are here, that they know these are things that have to be worked on. So will it be better tomorrow night? Probably not. But with this engaged process, I believe it will improve, and the issues that you have will start to float away.
Thank you all very much for this effort, because we now have a lot to think about. My name is Jack Holland, and I'm the recently appointed new president of the Parks Commission. So 3 weeks. And we've got, as I say, we've got a lot to work on. One of the things I wish that had been addressed is the issue of the state line. Because the state line is really a dividing line just as much as Troost is. And even more importantly, the state line impacts decisions with regard to development and land use planning and incentives and all the decisions that are made that impact the funding of the Parks Department and system. You've actually almost made a case for de-annexation of the Northland. And a lot of the information you've given us raises the question of how we maintain going forward this system that's going to require a lot of funding maintenance. It would be interesting to see a simulation of what de-annexation of the Northland. Do we have some Northland people here? I knew this would be provocative. Anyway, the point is that we really need to better understand the problem that we're facing in terms of maintaining this infrastructure. It's a problem on a national scale, but it's a particular problem for Kansas City, Missouri, given the state line challenges that we have. Just a thought. Thank you for everything you've done in your week here.
Made from interviews and data. One, sales taxes escape from Kansas City, Missouri, and go across the line to Kansas City, Kansas, because the reasonable amount of shopping is done there. A reasonable amount of people live in Kansas City, Kansas, but share in the resources of Kansas City, Missouri, by using the parks, the streets, and a lot of the services here. one of the things that we couldn't identify that there was really an active regional plan association working on regional plan here. That there was some discussion that, yeah, there is kind of one sort of when we have to apply for some federal money, but beyond that, it's not an engaged process. And I think part of the answer of starting to really understand that is the same process that we're talking about internally has to start to work regionally also, because you can't do it in a vacuum. Was that the last? No? Yes.
Just briefly, many of you on this panel have been on other ULIASPs, and so I just wanted to ask, in your experience, being on many, how could we best engage in this process beyond so that these great conversation ideas will continue for our community, especially through the city's update of the strategic plan?
I have served on many of these panels, right? But I would say this. I think this city has a unique opportunity based on the panels that I've served on before, right? Because there have been recent changes in city government at the commissioner level, at the parks level, at the city council level, at the city manager's level, at the mayor's level, right? And so one of the things that whenever you get the written report, you will see that we talked about having an orientation session, right? Where you get all these new team members, and I like to call them team members, right? Into a space for a half day to talk about vision and a process for continuous engagement and moving it forward. And I think through that process, you have a lot better chance of making this happen more effectively than in cities where everyone has been in place for the last 3,000 years, right? And they just do things this way because I don't even have to think to do it. What you have now is a new leadership team that is really thoughtful about how do we move this thing forward. So in terms of the cities I've been on panels, I think this is reasonably unique. I'm trying to think of another one where I've been where there's been this much change going on at once. Well, since that was the last question and we're 2 hours over, and we've survived some technical difficulties, I'm going to say that what we usually like to do is leave some sort of short-term and long-term and midterm things to do. Did we print up a list of those things?
They're actually below. So they're the next slide, John.
Oh, okay. Next slide. Oh yeah, there it is. I need to put my glasses on to do that. And these are things, what we like to do is leave you a list of things, and you can develop your own list. But we like to leave a list of things that you can do short-term, mid-term, long-term. Focus on social equity first, short-term. You can start doing that tonight. You can put together a panel to start talking about how do you get those things and move forward. Starting to think how to put together more engaged residential engagement. Well, that doesn't take money, that takes a little time and a plan, and you can start to do that because you've got plenty of park space and community centers and cultural institutions that you can convene gatherings. The racial equity assessment and audit, I have no idea how that works, but I'm sure there are people around that can figure that out and how that walks. I don't think you need to go raise $1 million, and build a building to do that. So these are short-term things that you can do. Midterm, this is an internal process. You've got to start to think about it. It's organization building, it's getting clear on mission. Those things, will will take some time, but it doesn't take a year. You know, you can start those things, and over the next 6 months, you can be well along with those things. And the same thing, midterm things, we're thinking, 3 to 6 months, you'll get that done. And long term, there are a lot of things that you got to figure out on how you manage these assets, et cetera, because there have to be new funding resources, et cetera. So it's just a way to start to think about what can I do now, and what can I do soon, and what will it take me a while to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, and thank you to our panelists. You can see why we were very excited to have everybody out this morning to hear all the work. And as you can see, there's a ton of work. We have been taking names, and we have a lot of information on all of you in this room, so we'll be anticipating some help from all of you to carry this out. Paul and his team, Gwen, Diana, thank you. Thank you to Carmen. I think Carmen Carmen's trying to hide always. Carmen, Esther, Roosevelt, Krista on our team for putting this all together. And I just appreciate it. And I love a good challenge. You've laid one out for us, and I'm ready to get to work. So thank you all very much.